welcome to this edition of Slugger TV. This is the fourth part in our series of The Reset, hosted in partnership with Ulster Bank. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the wider impact that the coronavirus pandemic has had on the Northern Ireland economy. And to go through this very interesting topic, we have Richard Ramsey, who's Chief Economist from Ulster Bank, and we have Alan Meban, who's Director of CBI Northern Ireland. Richard, I want to go to you first. Just broad overview, what impact has this had on the Northern Ireland economy?
Well, we've seen the deepest, fastest recession that our economy has ever experienced, and we've seen economic indicators and record rates of decline, the like of which we never imagined we could see, whether that was everything from car sales in April falling by 99.4%. We've seen the economy, both from the first quarter and second quarter, because we had a bit of the lockdown in March, we've basically seen the private sector shrink by around 25%. And if we compare that to the last recession, it's probably about double what we saw in the last recession, which was over a 6-year period, which we've seen in a couple of quarters. So really stark indicators. Mm-hmm. And if you think, where is the level of private sector output? It's lower than any time since the NISRA series began at the first quarter of 2005. It's about 13 or 14% below that. So it's actually probably round about late 1990s levels. Mm-hmm. So the Stormont executive finds that the economy is round about in the second quarter. There has been a recovery in the third quarter, but in the second quarter, it was back to where they started when the Good Friday Agreement was signed in 1998.
Okay, Angela, what have you seen from the broader impact?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no part of the economy hasn't been touched by this, and it's certainly for businesses been probably. I mean, we thought we had a challenge with Brexit. It's made us realise that you couldn't get any worse, really. I think companies, particularly back in March and April when it first kicked off, looking at issues around, we had the confusion as to whether people could come into work or not. Were they essential workers? Was it an essential sector? We had a bit of a more severe lockdown than the rest of the UK because of that, because of the uncertainty. We had companies struggling to get staff through the door, particularly in those essential sectors. We had difficulty with supply chains. We had companies looking at demand falling through the floor. And again, I suppose it depends on what sector you're dealing with. So, what we saw immediately was, things that we're really good at, like tourism, hospitality, the aerospace industry, absolute collapse. Whereas manufacturing, if it was food manufacturing, for example, it was fine. It was doing well, and they saw big increases in output, but then struggled to get workers. I think there's not one sector hasn't been impacted. Even if it comes to companies that have done quite well through it and have managed to keep their head above board, like the services sector, for example, they have had to transform in terms of people working from home. They've had to change the way they operate, the way they work, and costs gone up dramatically. Businesses saying, how do I bring people back, bring them back in a safe way? Some companies spend hundreds of thousands of pounds to make the environment safe. And a big impact on employees as well. Mm-hmm. A lot of uncertainty, a lot of change, and really quite stressful.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, in the week that we're recording, Richard, it seems like we're kind of on a treadmill, and we haven't really moved very much since March. We're kind of back to where we seem like we started. What impact are we seeing in terms of being able to plan? Because one thing that anyone I've talked to who's running a business, we've had plenty of people in here from very different sectors, all saying it's hard to plan beyond a month in advance. So what are you seeing the impact of that?
Well, yes, it's an inability to be able to plan was actually it was the top answer for NISRA's COVID-19 opinion survey, which was done in the summer, where it was over 80% had said that was how the pandemic had affected them the most. In terms of business, yes, it's uncertainty. We always talk about businesses don't like uncertainty, and they've had it by the lorry load over the last year. So we had already had that with Brexit, and then now with this pandemic, and we've still got issues such as Brexit to sort out. So businesses simply do not have the bandwidth to deal with all of those issues, and indeed economists struggle with the bandwidth to stay on top of all the issues in detail on that front. And at the minute, a lot of firms, they're in survival mode, so planning and investing for the future just aren't on the radar. And you have to think, even when we came in before this pandemic, underinvestment was a key problem with the business sector, where we weren't investing. So it's now being compounded. So, because ultimately the economic recovery and economic growth, you reap what you sow, you invest, you'll get future growth. We haven't been sowing the seeds of investment before this crisis, during this crisis, and that's going to lead to lack of economic growth in the future.
I was going to say, one of the the interesting stats around what Richard has just said there is, one of the banks told me recently that in their most recent 6-week period, relative to the same time last year, investment was down 90%. 90%. So, you need to have a bit of certainty. And particularly, this is a time of year where companies are normally thinking about, next year, 2021, where are we going? What staff do we need? What markets are we going to target? Haven't been able to do that, and that is really difficult. And as Richard says, it will have ramifications for how we recover as well.
Yeah, and how do you think, Richard, just in terms of businesses coping? So obviously we're talking about, the words that we didn't even consider last year, like face masks, social distancing, circuit breakers, and so on and so forth. How do you think that businesses are coping in Northern Ireland, and how have they innovated and coped since March?
Well, you've probably got the whole spectrum, from those firms who have adapted and coped very well, or the phrase we're hearing is pivoted, whether it's manufacturers who then started changing what the products they made into PPE, like block blinds. Macrofelt, my hometown, has done that. And you've got the likes of, in the pharmaceutical sector as well, where we saw every sector saw declines in output in the second quarter, with one exception, and that was the manufacture of pharmaceuticals and chemical products, which was the likes of the Randox, who've obviously done well out of the testing on this front. But in these kind of crises, there's always winners and losers, and there's always firms who are able to seize on opportunities and do well, and those who'll suffer. And I suppose we've seen the full spectrum of that, and those firms which have been unable to cope, not through their own sort of lack of skill set, as it were, are those ones which have to get close and have socialising, whether it's a hospitality sector, whether it's sort of hair and beauty, even dentists, etc. All of those ones which have suffered the most, and it is very difficult to run an organisation or a firm, particularly if you're trying to run it profitably, whenever social distancing and all of these costs are added in. And many business models for some firms and sectors simply do not work under this environment, and until it changes, they are not viable.
Yeah. Angela, have you found the businesses have coped and adapted in Northern Ireland?
I think, as I said, it depends on the sector. It also depends on the company size, and you do tend to see the bigger companies tend to be able to, because they've more resource, they've more agility in terms of moving teams and moving people around, that they've coped a bit better with it. I think particularly very small firms, if you think about maybe a small coffee shop owner, very little flexibility in the way they operate and the way they can change their business model. So bigger companies, particularly the external facing, the exporters, they're used to a lot of challenges, and I guess for them it will be things like global demand, because this isn't just within our own economy. There's huge ramifications around the world in terms of supply chains, in terms of orders. So for them, it's the external environment very important. But also I think confidence has really impacted companies, and they would say as well, clarity of message from government is really important. One retailer told me recently that they had 10 weeks of stable sales over the summer, which were still maybe only about 80% of where they were the year before. But once we heard talk of a circuit breaker, what was it, 3 weeks ago with the Prime Minister, their sales slumped another 33% just because consumers didn't feel confident to go out into that type of store. It wasn't a food store, it was just general shopping, and they got hit really quite hard with it. So again, it depends on the company size, it depends if they're foreign direct investors or indigenous, and it depends on their sector.
Yeah, and Richard, you were talking there about the last recession that a lot of people my age would have graduated into, and a lot of my friends certainly then would have went off around the world and got jobs in New Zealand, Canada, Australia. And you mentioned, you were talking with Mick Fealty a few weeks ago, and you mentioned about that's not really an option. And we saw today unemployment has gone up, particularly for those under the age of 35. Just elaborate, if you could, a wee bit about just the impact on younger people who are coming into the job market.
Yeah, well, it's during recessions, the younger population are always hit harder because they're the ones who are just either starting off their career and entering the labour market for the first time. And so during a recession, what you then see is businesses then have hiring freezes or start laying off staff, and therefore the younger generation don't get those opportunities. And yes, it's really challenging for the younger age group, because you would be sort of saying, if people were coming out of university or coming out of school and they didn't know if there weren't jobs for them, you would be saying, this is where you take your time out, go around, do the gap year, do something positive with your own self-development, and travel is the most obvious thing you do, and you cannot do that. Similarly, in terms of trying to get work experience, not just for school leavers or people who are graduating, but also work experience for people at schools. How can you get work experience, or even people who have joined firms, that whole stale kind of experience of meeting your team on a Zoom call and not having any proper sort of face time. And we're seeing that sort of with universities as well. Like, that's a real challenge, and the younger generation are the least exposed to this from a medical perspective, but they're on the front line as far as the kind of economic damage is concerned.
Companies will tell me that they've had difficulty bringing people that they'd promised maybe apprenticeships to, because they would have been mentored by somebody in the office who's now working from home. So even getting those opportunities, as Richard says, around work experience, around apprenticeships, and the usual routes that we would put young people through, has been particularly difficult. And very often when it comes to working from home, that's the feedback that companies are getting in their surveys, is that the young people actually, because we're all sociable beings, they like to be in an office environment, they like the water cooler conversation, and they also really benefit from having that mentoring with older workers in the workforce, to give them ideas, to show them how things done. And so for them it's been quite a lonely kind of time trying to get up to speed with the working environment without the supervision that our generation would have had.
Yeah. And obviously, going back, that leads nicely on to my next question about working from home. Obviously, on your way here, coming through Belfast city centre, you can see there's much less footfall. Most departments and most places are still doing working from home. You've outlined one or two of the challenges for that. Are you seeing any other wider impacts of that policy on the wider local economy?
It is issues such as footfall in our town centres and city centres. Some of the suburbs and out of town sort of areas are actually benefiting from the kind of working from home, because people are maybe going to the nearest place to their home rather than where they worked. But you even then take even those retailers who are maybe involved in selling workwear. People aren't buying suits. If you're working from home, your kind of wardrobe gets downgraded a few levels, and I suppose ultimately it will then impact on demand for property, commercial real estate, what is going to happen there, then just all the kind of firms, then just like my own organisation, where we're all sort of working from home, will we need the office space that we have currently? Probably not on that sort of scale. So will we go back to where we were once this all passes? I don't think we will, because in many ways what the pandemic has done is it's actually accelerated a number of trends which were already there, such as working from home, technology and the ability to do that. So we're going to see this kind of hybrid working from home in the office model, and I would expect I'm not going to be in the office any more than a couple of days a week as my kind of default setting. That's completely new, something I never thought of at the start of this year.
Mm-hmm. And Angela, obviously, I've spoken to a number of chief executives who before, as Richard was saying, were adverse to staff working from home, and they've now 180'd, and the debates, do we even need offices? This is good, but what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the jury is out on it as to how it will end up eventually, because we're getting mixed signals. So we know that we have benefited. We've seen carbon reduction. You know, our aims to get carbon down has been really influenced by this, and that's a good thing. We've seen some people realising that they can work from home just as productively as they could in the office. And as Richard says, you know, it's made a difference to their quality of life, to their balance. You know, they don't have the commute, they don't have to spend the clothes or the work wardrobe money on clothes. But in other ways, some employers are mentioning to me that they find it quite difficult around productivity for teams. And they say while individuals might be productive, they're not seeing that kind of group innovation coming through, those conversations that they very often need to drive. And innovation is what drives economic growth. Companies are saying as well that they feel that they probably will retain a presence in it might not be city centres, you know, it could be, you know, outside of city centres, hubs, but it'd be more for collaborative meetings and team meetings and networking, as opposed to, you'll not see those rows of desks that you might have seen in the past. That's what they think now, but we are also, and it is a really valid point, that we're seeing an increase in stress levels, in mental health issues, and that might not be from just working in isolation, but obviously the press and what's going around in terms of numbers of positive cases, all that has an impact on people's mental health. But we are seeing a rise in mental health issues, and as I say, we're getting that feedback that young people not so fussed on it, and not everybody's home is set up to work from home. You know, some young people are still living with their parents, some, you know, people might have, you know, young children in the house. It doesn't blend for everybody, and, you know, I mean, we even heard stories about people didn't have a desk to work from home, they were using an ironing board. So, you know, there's going to be changes there, and you know, it'll work for some people. I do suspect it will be a more blended model. But we also have to think about what are the total ramifications, good for carbon, good for reduction, but how do we work on our city centres to make sure that we don't hollow them out in this new environment that we're in.
Yeah, and even going back to that, Richard, I mean, not everywhere in Northern Ireland even has good broadband access. For example, not everywhere. I mean, I've had people say to me, "Oh, I can't give you that wee bit of work because I'm down in the parents' house out in rural Tyrone, and we don't have great internet." So
yeah, no, absolutely, and that was also an issue with homeschooling during the lockdown as well, where it's almost like pupils' performance and educational experience could be determined whether they had access to a computer or not in the first instance, and then even if they had the access to the internet. And I think potentially what we could see with this kind of new form of working from home, because where we are at the minute is an extreme form of working from home. I think what we'll go back to will be obviously less extreme, but it does throw up opportunities, particularly if you think of social inclusion and digital inclusion, particularly up at the northwest. If in terms of somebody applying for a job in Belfast, or even in Dublin, or even in London, the actual requirement to be living or close, or even like commuting to those places is kind of going. So that throws up opportunities where you can now tap into job opportunities essentially from your house. But while that's an opportunity, it's also a threat as well, because if we can do that other countries can do that as well, and you'll see the competition intensifying in places like India, etc., where we've got lots of high qualified graduates, speak English, all of those kind of things. So there's going to be a lot of change in the next year or so.
I was going to say, it's kind of good news that the Stratum project in Northern Ireland is being rolled out in the background, and it's been won recently by one of the local companies, Fibres, to deliver that broadband right across Northern Ireland. That will make a difference, because I'm actually still quite surprised at how you could be sitting on a conference call and some people start to, and then they start to lose connection, and you're just, maybe they just don't want to be in the call and they're pretending they can't, but it surprises me that this is still happening, and so there's still things to be sorted out in that. It needs to be resolved. But yeah, I mean, that point that Richard made around the talent and while we can now pick up, and we know, for example, that we've had a huge deficit of people with software skills in Northern Ireland and IT skills. And in fairness, the Minister's done a lot about that in terms of putting money into universities for those sort of skills to develop. But nonetheless, companies here are worried that those global players could start to poach the guy sitting in Cookstown that's working for them, because as he works in Cookstown for somebody in Belfast, he could work for somebody in New York or London as well. So will we see, what will the overall consequences be of if our talent gets poached? But then there's also the opportunity of local companies that they could say, well, I can hire people sitting in Poland. But what does that do? Because you want to think about, where their taxes being paid, or where are they sitting, where's the multiplier effect of employees. So how this plays out in terms of the whole macro economy is going to be quite difficult and won't be known for some time.
Yeah, and obviously looking at some of those issues, we mentioned, Angela mentioned the B word, Brexit. Obviously we're 2 months out from that, and that was seen as a bit of a backlash against globalisation, but interestingly the pandemic may well accelerate some of those globalised trends that we've been seeing for the past 3 decades.
Yes, absolutely, and particularly if you even think of like economic policy and macroeconomic policy, it's totally been sort of upended, and we're almost seeing the kind of monetary policy, the cutting interest rates or doing quantitative easing. They're with like Bank of England interest rates at 0.1%. They've nowhere to go really, other than if they go sort of like negative. So what we're actually seeing is a big switch now back to fiscal policy, whereas it's actually government spending, taxation, and that's one of the big global trends that we're going to see going forward. And also a lot of these kind of trade wars and tech wars that we've been seeing, that's linked to the fact that China has, we remember the last recession where China was significantly smaller than it is today. And China is potentially going to be the same size as the US economy within the next few years. Those are the kind of changing global shifts of economic power from the West and the United States to the East are only going to continue. And add to that, we have climate change, aging population, all of those kind of things, and the policymakers' inbox is going to be pretty full.
Angela, just on Brexit, I know you're probably sick hearing about it. We're only 4 years on now at this point. What about the potential? Because this is all coinciding together. We're literally just 2 months away from. Maybe we'll get a withdrawal agreement. Maybe we'll get a future relationship agreement. Maybe we won't.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I'm probably a bit more hopeful now than I have been in the past for getting an agreement and getting a deal done. And hopefully, I mean, I don't think it'll be done in October, but we're thinking probably November is, looking highly likely, and it's in everybody's interests to get that deal, whether it's Europeans or our own interests. But I think for companies, it's about timing too, because we talked earlier about planning. Planning is a real issue. There's very real parts of a business that need to be done in advance of the 1st of January. So even, for example, labelling your product. You have fresh food and you have it in cold storage all around Europe. You can't have the wrong labels on it on the 1st of January because it would be illegal to sell it. So there's issues around getting that deal done, but getting it done on time for companies to plan and prepare, and then giving companies time to implement what's needed to be done, whether that's changing their IT systems, whether that's ordering their new labels in advance. So that's what we're really hoping for. I am quite confident. I mean, we have constantly in the CBI fed up to government the challenges with business, and they have been receptive and they've listened, and I think they know there's a huge stress that companies are under right now. They couldn't possibly take any more. I know there was some kind of thoughts, well, could the damage from Brexit be swept under the COVID carpet? Yeah. No, I don't think anybody's prepared to do that to business at the moment. I'm quite confident, the Chancellor very much appreciates the stresses that they're under. Their backs are to the wall, and to walk away from your largest export market and your biggest and largest neighbour in terms of trade would just be beyond foolish. So there will be a deal. I'm quite confident there'll be a deal, and but it's the timing and it's giving companies the time to adapt to it will be the most important thing. Mm-hmm.
Nice bit of optimism. In terms of government policy, because I heard an economist saying a few weeks ago that we're kind of at the Wile E. Coyote stage of the economic impact of this. We're off the cliff, the feet are still going, but we just haven't dropped yet. Furlough comes to an end at the end of October, then the new scheme starts up with 67% of wages. Is there anything more government could be doing, should be doing, both at a devolved level and at a national level, Richard?
I suppose, yeah, we've seen the government, UK government and indeed Stormont sort of do things that at the start of the year we'd never imagined that they would do, whether that's with the UK, with the furlough scheme. We never thought people would be getting paid for staying at home and not working. Also, we didn't think that a Chancellor would give you 50% off your dinner or a meal out, so we've seen all those sort of things. I think we will see more of that, and in many ways this is kind of like running a marathon, this mm-hmm. recovery, and the Chancellor is coming in and providing almost like feeding stations along the way to have more support, and we will probably see, like he's had his summer plan, his winter plan. We'll have a spring, summer and autumn plan probably next year as well. So a lot of it is going to be just more money, more support, maybe more targeted support for particularly supply chains, and we're thinking of even the aerospace sector as well. We don't want to see a loss of skills happen there, but the challenge is until you see an upturn in the aviation market and global mm-hmm. passenger numbers picking up again, there's going to be problems there. But the other things are, it's what can governments do? It's probably even then things like apprenticeships, although we know there's issues with that if mm-hmm. it's like the kind of working from home. But it's in many ways it's then trying to keep as much of the economy open and moving and operating, because this virus is probably going to be with us for quite some time yet, and it's how do we live with it and how do we maximise through use of technology, social distancing and all of those kind of things, how do we keep as much of the economy ticking over as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. You have to really think about business continuity. How do we make sure that the business environment, that the policy is flexible to the business environment? It needs to be agile, it needs to adapt depending on how circumstances change. But overall, the goal for policy should be business continuity, allowing business to continue in a very safe way, learn how we live with COVID, that we don't, and get that balance right, we don't wreck the economy any further than what's, the damage that's been done, get that Brexit deal to give companies a bit of insight as to mm-hmm. how the future is going to play out and what they can plan for. And I think probably if you're thinking, what are the big things that government can do to help us get over this and to recover quicker? Invest in people and invest in infrastructure and those sort of things that will set us up for long-term economic growth.
Okay. And Richard, I want to get a brief final thought from you. In terms of the immediate challenges that exist there for the economy, what do you think are coming up in the next 5 to 6 months?
Immediate challenges, I think one of the issues then next year is going to be, we're going to see the surge in unemployment, and it's going to be how do you deal with that, how do you minimise that, how do you flatten the unemployment curve, as it were. There's then also then the whole issue of debt as well, because what we've seen is 600-700% increase in bank lending to two corporates in the second quarter alone, and a lot of that was emergency lending. And there's going to be an issue of how businesses or SMEs are going to be able to function with levels of debt going forward. And many of the firms will find that they're just too indebted to actually be viable going forward. So I think we'll see on a national basis, we'll see schemes about how we've already seen the Chancellor announce how we could extend what's known as extend and pretend. It's some of those loans be extended out from 6 to 10 years and interest rate holidays and all of those kind of things. But ultimately, I think there's going to have to look at the actual level of debt. And then, of course, we've got to get our infrastructure projects moving. We've got to get tackling our skills and a lot of the underlying economic problems that were here before this happened, and such as no skills and qualifications. We've too many people on that front. All of those areas need to be targeted.
Okay, thank you very much for your insights on a very fascinating topic. This is the last in our Slugger TVs as part of the Reset series in partnership with Ulster Bank. I want to thank my guests, Richard Ramsey and Angela McGowan. You can keep up to date with everything else in the Reset series on sluggerotool.com. Thank you for watching.